Today's lecture is called Surviving the Wilderness. So, I don't know, this is something I discovered this week as I was kind of looking into like how to open this up. And there's actually something called the Survival University. And according to the website, it is located in central Colorado, and it features experienced seasoned guest instructors from all over the country. And it says that we can provide you with all the survival training that you would ever want to need or know. And I thought, well, gosh, wouldn't that have been great for Israel to be able to go to school before they got into this situation? Moses needed some instructors in his little group, but unfortunately, he didn't get them. But I just discovered that the TV show Survivor is actually on its 43rd season. Is that crazy? I'm like, where did that happen? And people, I think, are fascinated by watching this group of people who are taken out of their comfort zone and they're put into some really harsh situations. I said, without access to their cell phones, which is probably traumatic enough for a lot of young people. But of course, they're followed around by film cameras, so don't like that idea. But, my youth pastor thought it would be a really good idea to take a group of middle school students on this 3-day backpacking trip. And I can't think of anything less fun than leading a bunch of whiny middle schoolers through the wilderness. After the first hour, he got so tired of listening to us complain that he made us memorize the 23rd Psalm. And so I still know the 23rd Psalm from that middle school backpacking trip because that was the only way he could get us to shut up and quit complaining. And I said, on this backpacking trip, I certainly felt like I was walking through the shadow of the valley of death, but I didn't realize it was going to be uphill the whole way. So remember that God sent Israel into the wilderness, not because it was the easiest way to go, but because it was the best way to go. He had a lot to teach these people. The easy route, we learned it was patrolled by Egyptian soldiers, and they would take them straight through the territory of the Philistines, who were some pretty bad dudes. So the Judean wilderness is where they would be tested on some critical survival skills. So we're going to look at those survival skills that this nation encountered. The first one was surviving the need for water. So let me pray, and then we'll dig into this. Lord, thank you that you lead us through places that sometimes we don't want to go. And Lord, just like the Israelites, I pray that you would help us to trust you, and whatever that looks like, that we would call on you first, Lord. Before we resort to whining and complaining, we would realize that you are there, you are in the midst of that journey with us. And we pray this in your name. Amen. All right, surviving the need for water. So every test the Israelites face in our passage has to do kind of with their own physical needs and their physical discomfort. And verse 22 of chapter 15, it tells us that they had traveled 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. So I don't know if they brought any water with them and they ran out, or if they just left in a hurry and didn't bother to think that part through. According to Medical Daily, our bodies can only survive 5 to 7 days without water. And that 65% of our body's molecules are made up of water. So within 3 days, our organs begin to slowly shut down and our brain begins to slowly shut down. Now, a very obvious sign of dehydration is irritability. Did you know that? So if you're feeling really irritable, drink some water. Moses leads the Israelites in verse 23 to a place they named Marah, which of course we learned that means bitter, and the water was undrinkable, and the people were beyond cranky at this point. In verse 24 it said the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" 3 days earlier, they were praising and exalting God for his provision, and now they've completely forgotten his goodness and protection over them. People grumble and complain when they want something that they don't have. Most of us have raised children and know this to be true. I didn't think of myself as a whiner until my husband quit his job years ago to start his own photography business. Now, we had 3 kids under 5, and I did a lot of grumbling in those early first few months. There was a lot of things that I couldn't have. We were on the bare bones budget of what we could spend, and we've been saving for 10 years to go to Hawaii for our 10th anniversary. And, every month putting money aside for this for 10 years. And then all of a sudden we had to spend that money on groceries. And I have to say, I was a little grumbly about that because, I had just been looking forward to this. But God was clear that my whining was not very productive, and I would just have to learn to trust and watch what he was going to do. We grumble and worry and become anxious because we don't fully trust that God is going to provide. So Moses had been through survival training, and he knew the basic rules of survival. Call on the Lord, listen, and obey. In verse 25, it said, "And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet." So God shows his incredible mercy because he provides drinkable water to a bunch of whiners, and he takes this contaminated water and he turns it into living water. And we got to see in our study this week that New Testament parallel here as Jesus tells the woman at the well that he is the source of living water. He who drinks this water will never thirst again. Well, God then sits Israel down and he decides to give them a crash course on the second and third rules of wilderness survival. In verse 26, he says, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that you put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Call on the Lord, listen, and obey. Those are the 3 things he wants Israel to learn as they begin this journey. So God lays it out clearly. If you obey me, then things will go well for you. If you don't obey, then you're going to reap the consequences. The Israelites were very familiar with what God's wrath looked like. They had seen it poured out onto the Egyptians. But God finishes his statement in verse 26, and he says, "I am the Lord your healer." He identifies himself as Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals. God shows that he has healing power, not just over this body of bitter water, but he has it over their physical bodies and their physical needs as well. When we're trying to survive in a rough situation, isn't it good to know that we have the ultimate leader who not only knows where we need to go, but also has the power over our physical bodies as well. Healing doesn't always happen for us in our earthly life, but we know ultimately that one day we are going to be completely restored. We're going to experience that perfect healing. We just need to call on him, listen, and obey. Israel is given a gift in their wandering as they are next led. So we're kind of skipping to the second half of the water scenario, and then we'll go back and cover the manna in a minute. But they are given this beautiful oasis in the midst of this desert. Elam is described as having 12 springs, 70 palm trees, and it sounds like this beautiful little tropical place for them. God shows Israel, and he shows us, that there is hope around the corner in the middle of a desert. We just need to trust in God's care for us. He loves us, and God is kind, which I love the song that Ashley chose, "The Good, Good Father." He is a good, good Father, and he's showing his goodness to his whiny children, even though they didn't deserve it. You know, you'd think after seeing God's faithfulness the first time they had no water, that Israel would automatically call on God to show up when they faced the same situation again in chapter 17. But this is unfortunately not the case, because here we find the Israelites setting up camp at Rephidim, and once again, they're quarreling with Moses and demanding water. You know, why do you put the Lord to the test, Moses asks. It's always good to learn from other people's mistakes, I say, and I try to teach our kids, instead of having to learn them from your own mistakes. Well, our passage teaches us 3 ways not to test the Lord. And this is from chapter 17. First, by making demands on his appointed leaders. In 2a, it says, "Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.'" The second way not to test the Lord is by doubting his faithfulness. 3b, it says, "So why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" And then 3, to doubt the Lord's presence. And in verse 7, it said, "He called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" They doubted his presence. Testing the Lord meant that Israel was trying God's patience. You know, how far could they push God before he just decided to wipe them all out? I would have done it right first step into the desert. But God is very patient and compassionate. When God says don't do something, sometimes we do it anyway because we like to have that sense of being in control. You know, we're impatient. God says, bring our needs and our frustrations to him. You know, we like to do it our way, but then we turn around and blame him when things don't go well with our own choices. Well, God responds to Israel with this heavy hand, but it's always this heavy hand out of love for his people. And remember that he disciplines those that he loves. Well, Moses hits the rock with his staff and he brings forth water. And so once again, we're given this beautiful picture that we looked at in our study today of Christ. You know, he is our living water. And, you know, Jesus provided the water of life that we so desperately need. But that water only came as Jesus, the rock, was struck on our behalf. Well, now our second test, surviving the need for food. So Israel quickly forgets God's provision and they begin to complain once again. And it wasn't just a few whiners in the bunch, it was the whole nation, according to verse 2. And then in verse 3 it says, "And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we had died in the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out of this into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger.'" How little or how soon we forget, because they were thinking life was so much better in slavery than it was being free. God puts Israel's survival skills to the test to see whether or not they're going to call on the Lord, whether or not they're going to listen, and whether or not they're going to obey. You know, he provides an abundance of bread from heaven, and they're told just to gather what they need for that day. I mean, that would be really hard to know what. You would have that temptation to want to hoard. You know, they've been enslaved and probably limited on what they were able to have, so that temptation to hoard would have been really strong. Well, on the 6th day, they were to gather twice as much of what they needed so that they could rest on the seventh day. And he's teaching them this picture of the importance of Sabbath rest. He's going to introduce that idea of Sabbath when we get to the 10 Commandments. The Israelites are so busy grumbling. Again, they miss what God has done for them. They are chronic complainers. They grumbled when the Egyptians enslaved them. When they were set free from slavery, they grumbled because they were trapped at the Red Sea. God opened up the sea and saved them. And then they grumbled because they didn't have water. And And then again, they grumbled because they were hungry. God gives them bread, but the bread isn't good enough, so he provides quail. And then they grumble because they don't like their leaders. So God keeps meeting these physical needs, and they always find something else to grumble about. I think we know people that kind of resemble the Israelites. I know I do, and happen to have someone in my family who, no matter what happens, they always find something to grumble about. So what do you do in a situation like this? What do you do with people like this? What did Moses do? He keeps pointing out to the Israelites the goodness of the Lord. I mean, that's what Moses wants Israel to focus on, and that's what we need to focus on as well. It's hard to see what the Lord is doing when you are too busy complaining. In chapter 16, verse 6, it says, "So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, 'At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord.'" Moses keeps pointing them back to the Lord. And in verse 8, Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, and you grumble against him." When we feel like grumbling, instead we need to remember all the good things the Lord has done. The Israelites were so busy whining that they missed what God was trying to reveal to them through the bread. And so now I've got a few things. The amazing thing about manna. First of all, it was a miraculous provision from God. The Israelites responded in verse 15. They said, "What is it?" It was not like anything they had seen before. The Hebrew translation of the word manna means, "What is it?" It said it was sweet like honey. I mean, he could have just given them something bland, but he made it delicious. Second, there was always enough. In verse 18 it says, "But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over. Whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat." There was always enough. And third, it sustained them. In verse 35, the people of Israel ate manna for 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. We always talk about needing to eat like a balanced diet, and the 5 food groups: dairy, fruit, grain, proteins, and vegetables, to have this healthy diet. But whatever God put into that manna, it was enough to keep them filled and healthy as they wandered through the desert for 40 years. We all ask, well, why didn't they eat some of the animals they brought? I don't know. But they ate manna, and it sustained them. It was enough. No one suffered from malnutrition while God was providing the food. And then the fourth thing is that manna was a foreshadowing of Christ. In John 6:51, it says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." The third test the Israelites encounter is surviving the predators. So people on a survival wilderness experience should always be concerned about predators, probably snakes, scorpions, wild animals. But in Israel's case, it's an entire army. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau. They were raiders. They would pick off the weak on the edges of their encampment. In verse 9, we're introduced to Joshua for the first time, and it's obvious that he had risen to be a leader among the Israelites because Moses picks him to lead the army. So we can assume that they were probably doing some military maneuvering as they were in the desert, as they were starting, because God knew that they were going to be facing a lot of predators as they go onto their journey. So Joshua, we know, will later lead Israel, the nation of Israel, into the promised land. So Joshua, he's sent into battle with physical weapons. while Moses goes to the hilltop to do battle with his faith and his staff. And Moses didn't go into battle alone, we're told. He had support. He had people there. He had people to lift his arms when he grew weary. And what a beautiful picture for all of us of knowing just the importance of Christian community in our lives. Those people who can hold us up when we're struggling. You know, Israel eventually defeats the Amalekites, and God makes sure that this story of God's faithfulness is recorded for future generations. He wants Israel to always remember that God fights for them. The success of this battle is given solely to the Lord. Moses builds an altar as a memorial, and he calls it "The Lord is my banner." He wants Israel to never forget. It was clearly God's mighty hand that gave Israel victory over their enemy. Israel spent almost 2 months in the wilderness trying to survive before they were brought to the base of Mount Sinai, and that's what we'll pick up next week. Every test they were given, they failed because they didn't put their trust in the right place. Their survival can only be attributed to the power of God's name, His mercy, His kindness. He's a good, good Father. All God wanted for them was to cry out to Him, to listen and obey. We know that Jesus also spent 40 days in the wilderness, and He fully relied on the power of God, and He passed every test that He was given with flying colors. You know, He knew the basics of wilderness survival. So what about us? When we have frustrations and needs, how do we respond? Are we whiners? Or do we take them immediately to God? We need to kind of think about that. When you find yourself with that temptation to grumble and complain, that we need to cry out to God. You know, I shared how at first when my husband started this business and we had to give all of our 10-year savings for our Hawaii fund to spend it on groceries and just paying bills. Well, my husband got a call from to photograph a wedding for one of my dad's best friends. He had photographed their son's wedding in Boulder a few years ago. Well, they happened to live in Hawaii, and he really liked the job my husband did on his son's wedding. So he was wondering, if he were to pay all of our expenses, would we be willing to fly to Hawaii to do his daughter's wedding? I mean, you know, God wants to bless us when we take His needs to Him. You know, I can't promise you all trips to Hawaii, but He knew exactly what I needed for Him to just say, I'm with you in this journey that you guys are taking on, this journey of faith. So will you choose to take your needs to God and trust that He will take care of you? Will you cry out to Him? Will you listen? And will you obey? Let me pray. Lord, you are merciful and kind, even when we are whiny and ungrateful. And Father, I thank you that you hear us in the midst of our misery. You hear us when we do cry out to you. You are with us. Father, help us to just remember all that the Israelites have endured. Let us learn from their mistakes, that we would not be people who whine and complain. We would be people who call out to you, who listen to you, and who live in obedience. Amen.